Away just for one day tomorrow. But Raj Chakraborty, Ginny Morden, you have been wonderful. Always great to have you on the panel. Kia ora to you both. Thanks to Charlie Drever putting the show together and Lisa Owen and Checkpoint Next. Stay with us here on RNZ National.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, the gloomy prognosis for people waiting to see a GP. As many as half of the country's slammed clinics are closed to new patients. So if you're sick, what do? Sport is about to get an independent integrity body following critical reports into player welfare and treatment. Minister Grant Robertson joins us. Police are investigating after a man is shot at multiple times after dropping his kid at school. A damning report is released into how ACC manages client information. And the building industry gets together to try and hammer out a solution to the jib board shortage. And is it time to curb cars on Auckland's Queen Street? Or are there too many roadblocks?
RNZ News at 5. Ahi Marie, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Armed police remain on guard in the small North Waikato town of Taupiri, where shots were fired outside a primary school this morning. The school was briefly put into lockdown after the shots injured a man in a car who'd just dropped his child off. The police say the shooting isn't related to wider gang tensions, but they're looking into an incident yesterday that they believe is connected. Waikato Mayor Alan Sanson says situations like this are a rarity in the region.
I know there has been lots of shootings on a daily basis in Auckland for the last 2 weeks, and this is not a common theme down here in the Waikato, I can assure you.
Parents on the school pickup this afternoon say the school kept them in the loop.
Didn't fear for the kids, it's just knowing what's going on, and that's the biggest issue. We knew it wasn't about the school, but the communication between everyone with what happened yesterday and what's happened today, that's probably the biggest fear.
The police say the injured man was able to drive himself to the Ngaruawahia police station to get help. They're asking anyone who saw the attack to come forward. People are waiting weeks for appointments at their family doctors as GP clinics struggle with winter illnesses, COVID infection and short staffing. According to the government's information service Health Point, as many as half the country's GP clinics have closed their books to new patients. Auckland GP Sandhya Ramanathan says the government needs to step in and help with the workload.
GPs and doctors are going to be doing themselves harm so that they can protect their patients. So burnout is a huge issue. A lot of the time we're motivated just to protect our patients and our colleagues. And so even though we ourselves are feeling tired, we still come to work and do the best we can. But the patient problems are becoming increasingly complex.
And there's more on that topic coming up on Checkpoint. An independent review has found the Ministry of Health didn't equitably meet the needs of Māori, Pacific and other vulnerable populations during the COVID-19 Delta outbreak of last August. Tess Brunton reports.
The report does note the ministry was successful overall at containing the spread of Delta, but it says the slow pace of policy making meant decisions had to be made without the necessary guidance, and the workforce reported fatigue, burnout and stress. The report recommends locally led solutions, engaging more with Māori and Pacific providers and leaders, and establishing a workforce development plan.
A damning independent review has found ACC's privacy culture is poor, its policies outdated and its staff not well informed. The review, by lawyer Linda Clark, was commissioned after RNZ revealed call centre workers had shared client information on Snapchat. ACC's chief executive, Megan Main, says changes will be made and the public can have confidence that the agency will treat their private information with respect.
We really want to take that more holistic view of how we think about people's personal information all throughout the organisation in everything we do. And I'm very committed to developing that culture within ACC.
Megan Main says all 30 recommendations made in the report will be implemented, but it will take until the end of next year to complete. And Winston Peters has instructed his lawyers to take legal action against Parliament's Speaker Trevor Mallard. The New Zealand First Leader and former Deputy Prime Minister was trespassed from the parliamentary precinct after visiting the protest occupation of the grounds. Mr Mallard later withdrew the ban and 4 others issued to former MPs. Mr Peters says that at the end of May, his lawyers contacted Mr Mallard and made it clear they'd pursue legal action if he didn't provide an explanation for the trespassing. He says the response they got failed to address the seriousness of the matter. To sport, and much of the football world is dismissive of the All Whites' chances of reaching the World Cup, but coach Danny Hay is unfazed. New Zealand play Costa Rica in Qatar tomorrow morning, with the winner advancing to the Cup finals. Costa Rica's ranked 31st in the world, 71 places above New Zealand. Despite being massive underdogs, Hay says there's a strong sense of self-belief in the side.
There's probably more expectation coming out of New Zealand than compared to the rest of the world. Probably people are writing us off, but I think New Zealanders are expecting a strong performance from us, and rightly so.
Veteran defender Winston Reid, who's been bothered by a groin injury, has been declared fit to play. Meanwhile, Australia have qualified for the finals by beating Peru 5-4 in a penalty shootout. The Golden State Warriors have beaten the Boston Celtics 104-94 to take a 3-2 lead in the best-of-7 NBA basketball finals. Game 6 is on Friday. Silver Ferns defender Karen Berger has been ruled out of the Commonwealth Games with a foot fracture that needs surgery. The squad for the Games is due to be named at the end of the month. And British runner Ricky Lightfoot has won the annual Man versus Horse race across the Welsh countryside, becoming the first person to finish ahead of the animal in 15 years. He won the 35-kilometre race in 2 hours 22 minutes, finishing just 2 minutes ahead of the horse called Lane Houseboy. That's the news.
A roadblock stopping affordable homes being built.
Seems perverse to me. A company would go to the effort of getting a copyright on a colour. They've made it rocket science. It's something that's very, very simple.
Auckland students rally for teacher aides to get a pay rise.
I want to show teacher aides that we really do value the work that they do and we really do appreciate them.
A family in COVID isolation is stranded outside its home when bad weather hits.
He said, no, you're not going through. My husband said, well, we live out there. And he goes, well, not today, you don't.
News as it comes to light. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
You're with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint next. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Wednesday. In the west of the North Island, from Northland to Kapiti, also the Central High Country. Occasional showers, some heavy from this evening, clearing from Manawatu to Kapiti early tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Waded Upper, Wellington, also for Nelson and Marlborough. Generally fine, but isolated showers about Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, and the odd shower elsewhere this evening. Northwest gales in exposed places south of Hastings, easing tomorrow. For Bulla and Westland, showers, some heavy with possible thunderstorms for Bulla this afternoon. Canterbury, fine apart from a possible shower about Banks Peninsula today. Central and North Otago, partly cloudy with isolated showers, clearing tomorrow. Dunedin, Clutha, Southland and Fiordland. Showers, some heavy, becoming confined to Fiordland and the south coast tomorrow evening. Snow above 300 metres, westerly gales in exposed places. And for Re Kohu, the Chatham Islands, showers, some heavy with possible thunderstorms, gale westerlies. The time is 7 minutes past 7. I'll update you with the latest headlines and traffic at 5:20.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Tonight, what happens when health's first line of defence starts to falter? As many as half the country's GP clinics aren't enrolling new patients amid a cocktail of winter illnesses, COVID infections and short staffing. Many others are asking people to wait weeks for appointments, and family doctors reckon the prognosis is gloomy, warning it could get worse before it gets better. Katie Todd and Marika Habazi have the story.
A war zone is how Auckland's GP Sandra Ramanathan describes her clinic on a busy day, and quiet days are now few and far between. Many of the patients are seeking help for their COVID infections, first-time cases and reinfections. Viruses like the flu have also been tracking upwards.
Then there's also RSV and other influenza-like illnesses. So, yeah, it is very busy in general practice at the moment, and GPs are concerned because even patients without previous medical conditions are getting quite sick.
And across New Zealand, there's fewer GPs to share this workload than there were just a couple of years ago. The workforce has been steadily declining. At any given time, a number are also having to isolate with COVID-19. It's only the early days of winter illnesses, yet Dr. Ramanathan says her fellow GPs are becoming burnt out and exhausted.
As GPs, as doctors, we took an oath to not do harm to our patients, but we didn't take an oath to do harm to ourselves.
One option GP clinics have to manage the demand is simply say no to new patients. Many are doing just that, according to Royal New Zealand College of GPs President Dr. Samantha Merton.
That's happening across the board, and if you look in any of the different regions, there'll be probably about 50% of practices are not enrolling patients. And that's just because of the workload that is involved, and you can't reliably provide appropriate care to more than a certain number of patients.
According to HealthPoint, there's no clinics in the cities of Invercargill or New Plymouth taking new enrolments at all. And in the regions where there's often just 1 or 2 doctors' clinics in each town, the problem is amplified. Take Northland, for example. According to HealthPoint, there's now no clinics enrolling new patients in the towns of Russell, Kaitaia or Kawakawa. Meanwhile, people who are enrolled are waiting weeks for an appointment. In Kaiwaka, locals say it's not good enough.
Can't get to see my doctor. Rang up. I can't get a telephone appointment with a GP until Friday, with a GP who I don't even know.
I had a friend and she went this last week and she tried to be seen and she got turned away and tried to explain to them what was wrong with her, and then she ended up going on the Saturday and having to pay $50.
GPs say it's the government's fault. The General Practice Association GenPro partly blames years of underfunding and under-resourcing. It fears clinics will have to slash services further because the government's 3% funding increase for family doctors this year falls short of inflation. Sanja Ramanathan accuses the government of failing to put in place a comprehensive management plan for COVID-19 beyond the vaccine rollout. She and a number of other prominent medical experts have launched a website called Vaccines Plus, lobbying the government to do more to mitigate the virus.
That Vaccines Plus approach means that masks need to be used, particularly we know that COVID's main transmission is airborne, so ventilation is key.
By simply relying on personal responsibility, the Vaccines Plus group warns there will be repeated waves of infection, an overloaded and dysfunctional healthcare system, and ongoing disruption to daily life.
And joining us now is Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners Medical Director, Dr. Brian Betty. Brian, it sounds bad. Is it that bad?
Oh, look, I think what you just heard is a fair reflection of what's happening in large parts of the country at the moment. We always get these winter overloads that occur. This year it is particularly pronounced due to the workforce issues, plus the fact we have this mixture of viruses with COVID on the top. And, I think in a lot of areas it's becoming very serious in terms of what's happening.
What areas?
Well, I think you nominated a couple of them. Northland in particular has been problematic for a while. We know Invercargill's had issues. We've seen issues in parts of Hawke's Bay, South Taranaki, East Pororua, South Auckland. Around the country we are seeing this start to emerge. And what used to be just a rural problem in terms of shortage of GPs, we are now seeing extend into provincial areas and also into urban areas as well. So, this has been building for a while, and I think this winter has really sort of started to ramp things up in terms of the workforce shortage for GPs that we have out there.
So, in the simplest of terms, why can't they take on more patients?
You can only do so much. The recommended safe level is 1 GP to about 1,300, 1,400 patients. There are GPs with 1,000 to 2,000 around the country now, 2,500, and there are only so many hours in the day. So GPs are working at capacity. This is the issue. It's not that they don't want to see their patients. It's not that they don't want to service their patient space. It's just that the workforce numbers don't allow it, and this is the problem that has developed.
So what happens if you turn up in a town or city and no one is enrolling patients, which is the case in some areas? What happens to you?
Well, at that point, you become reliant, and we've seen this around the country as well, on emergency departments, after-hours centres that provide acute episodic care, or we've seen a huge increase in the use of ambulance. That is the flow-on effect, and we've seen recently in Middlemore, ED just overflowing with patients because there are capacity issues in general practice, and that's where patients end up. So it puts a secondary large pressure on the hospital system and on the ambulance services.
So what would take pressure off GPs? What can be done immediately to assist?
Well, look, at this point, obviously longer term, we have to solve the workforce problems. There needs to be an acknowledgement, I think, from the government and the ministry that we do have an issue here, and I think there needs to be some urgent looking at what can be done in local areas to try and alleviate the situation immediately. However, we're seeing in the hospitals shortages of doctors and nurses as well, so it's across the board. So this isn't an easy issue to fix.
So whose fault is it that it's got this bad?
I think this has been an accumulation of 2 decades of no strategic planning around workforce. In New Zealand, we have 78 GPs per 100,000. In Australia, it's 118 GPs per 100,000. So we're already behind the 8 ball. We're training about 198 GPs a year to go into the workforce. We estimate we need 300 a year training just to maintain the numbers we have at the moment. So this is not something that's just developed this year. It is something that has been building over a couple of decades, and I think there's been a total lack of strategic planning around workforce, and that's been the issue.
What are the consequences of this further down the road in terms of preventive medicine, right? So, you get a text, this is a real-world scenario. Someone gets a text saying your GP's closed due to staff shortages. What happens with smear tests, prostate checks, mole checks, What are we looking at further down the line if all of these things go on the back burner?
Well, what you do see is things like chronic disease management, which is things like diabetes, ischemic heart disease, cancer in the community, not being managed. You start to see preventative care fall off. So what we're seeing across the country at the moment is backlogs of cervical screening and breast screening, as an example, dropping immunisation rates. So this has a profound effect on the health of the population. In order to have a healthy population with good outcomes and equitable outcomes as well, which is the other issue, we need to have adequate medical resourcing in the community and in hospitals, and at the moment we just don't have that.
I was really interested today when the Director-General of Health was giving his COVID update. He pointed out that New Zealand has about 2 million doses of the flu and only 1 million of them are in arms, right? The rest are on the shelf. Do we need to do some kind of flu vaccination drive like we did for COVID?
Oh, absolutely. So we've been putting out the message very strongly that vaccination is incredibly important this year. Certainly a lot of pharmacies have been opened up for vaccinations. Vaccination centres are giving flu, and general practice as they can are giving the flu vax as well. We're actually ahead on those priority populations. It's the over 65s, Māori and Pacific over the age of 55. And the younger patients than we have been previously, but it's still not enough. And we need to encourage people to go and get vaccinated, either in pharmacies, general practice where they can, or other areas.
Should more people be able to get it for free?
Look, that's one of the things that has been discussed. It was extended this year, which was the right thing to do. It was dropped to Māori and Pacific over the age of 55, which was exactly what needed to happen. And there were extensions in the younger age groups. But I think we could always do more.
Appreciate your time this evening. That's Dr. Brian Betty, who's from the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners. Armed police remain on the streets of a small Waikato town after a shooting close to a primary school. A man was shot at several times in his car in Taupiri at about 9:30 this morning. He was injured but drove himself to the police station for help. Police Area Commander Will Loughran says children at the school weren't in immediate danger but were put into lockdown as a precaution.
We understand there will be unease in the community. We have a significant police presence in the area and we will maintain that for as long as we need to. There is a specialist team of staff working on this to have the situation resolved as soon as possible. We understand there were multiple witnesses who saw or heard this altercation, and we encourage them to come forward as we continue to investigate the incident.
He says the two men knew each other and the police are investigating a related incident yesterday. Parents on school pickup this afternoon say the school let them know what was going on.
Didn't fear for the kids, it's just knowing what's going on, and that's the biggest issue. We knew it wasn't about the school, but the communication between everyone with what happened yesterday and what's happened today, that's probably the biggest fear.
Waikato Mayor Alan Sanson says the shooting has shocked the community.
A gentleman dropped his child off at the Taupo school this morning, obviously at school time, and as he was leaving the scene about 100 metres from the school, another gentleman of interest fired shots into his car. I understand there was 3 shots fired at the car, which actually hit the vehicle. The man obviously sped off from that and came directly through to Ngaruawahia Police Station, where he sought help and care to obviously from somebody that was trying to take shots at him.
Police say it is not gang-related. The incoming Police Minister, Chris Hipkins, has admitted the government needs to do more to tackle gang crime, but exactly what that is remains unanswered. He was given the role after yesterday's reshuffle saw it stripped from Poto Williams and now faces a hefty task to turn the narrative around. Fortunately, he says he enjoys a challenge. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
He's fast becoming Labour's fix-it man, given the health hospital pass after David Clark, then the responsibility for tackling COVID-19. Now, crime.
As a Minister of Police, I fully intend to back the police to make sure that they can get out there and do the very difficult job that they've got ahead of them.
But Chris Hipkins knows he has a difficult job ahead too, as the country's biggest city faces a continuing crime wave. Last night brought yet another ram raid, this one on a petrol station in East Auckland. The Prime Minister yesterday said Poto Williams had lost focus in the police portfolio and change was required.
I'm focused on the future now. I do think there's more that we can do around gangs. I think there's more that we can do around youth crime.
But few details yet. There are no easy fixes, as Chester Borrows can attest. A former police officer and National MP, he once sought to ban gang patches in his Whanganui electorate. He says that so-called tough-on-crime approach does not work, but as his former party knows, it is effective at drumming up votes.
Pulling the narrative back and setting the agenda is going to escape the government's capabilities unless they do it very quickly.
He says Chris Hipkins has the ability to do that as a more battle-hardened operator than his predecessor. But it will require a strong command of the portfolio, he says, and some fresh ideas.
They have to show something else that's going to work and work quickly.
The difficulty is underscored by the Police Association's Chris Cahill, who says a ministerial change is no silver bullet.
Are ministers really going to be able to change the significant problems we've got with gangs at the moment, or with ram raids, things like that? That's on-the-ground policing that's got to be done. And yes, there's some legislative change to be looked at, but it's not going to make changes overnight.
Alas, that's unlikely to placate many Aucklanders or the business owners being hit by crime. Sonny Korshall from the Dairy Owners Group has already requested a meeting with the new minister to set out what he thinks is required.
All these ram raids, the assaults, the robberies, they need to stop. This would only stop if the minister has the guts to speak up and send a strong message to the offenders that if they're doing the crime, they would have to do the crime.
Rhetoric around tough on crime is easy to do. I'm far more interested in solutions that work than rhetoric.
For now, Chris Hipkins' plans are just rhetoric, though. The details still to come. That's not surprising on day one of the job, but he'll have to get up to speed quick. He sits down with the Police Commissioner tomorrow morning.
It is 23 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And And we would love to hear your thoughts on anything you've heard on the program. Homai o whakaaro, do send us your feedback. How long do you reckon is a reasonable amount of time to wait for a GP's appointment? And what are your experiences out there? Do let us know. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at checkpointrnz, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's time we got to the headlines now. Anea Iwi mina pita kōrero.
Tēnā koe, Lisa. As many as half the country's GP clinics aren't enrolling new patients amid a concoction of winter illnesses, COVID infections and short staffing. Medical Director for the New Zealand College of General Practitioners, Dr. Brian Betty, told Checkpoint it's a problem that's been brewing for some time. Armed police remain on guard in the small North Waikato town of Taupiri, where shots were fired outside a primary school this morning. The school was briefly put into lockdown after the shots injured a man who'd just dropped his child off. The incoming Police Minister, Chris Hipkins, says he's not interested in calls to be tough on crime. He says what the government needs to tackle are the underlying causes of crime. Chris Hipkins, in his current role of Education Minister, has also ruled out a return to mandatory face masks for schools struggling with COVID and winter illnesses. He says he trusts schools to make their own decisions about masks for teachers and older pupils. Winston Peters has instructed his lawyers to take legal action against Parliament's Speaker Trevor Mallard. The New Zealand First Leader and former Deputy Prime Minister was trespassed from the parliamentary precinct after visiting the protest occupation of the grounds. And an independent review has found the Ministry of Health didn't equitably meet the needs of Māori, Pacific and other vulnerable populations during the COVID-19 Delta outbreak last August. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, there's really only one crash to report, and that's in Tauranga. Westbound lanes on State Highway 29A after Truman Road are blocked. There are various closures on Auckland's motorway tonight, so take a look at Wakakotahi for those. And Wellington's Mount Victoria Tunnel closes from 9 p.m. I'll update you with the latest headlines and traffic at 5:40.
Kia ora rā e hoa. Absolutely dire. That's Master Builder's summary of the jib board shortage that's left projects unfinished and some businesses struggling to stay afloat. Fletcher Building has an effective monopoly with about 95% of the market and says it's producing as much jib as fast as it can, and no one could have anticipated the significant jump in demand. Today, industry leaders met with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment to talk about solutions to the plasterboard shortage. Master Builder CEO David Kelly was at the meeting and joins us now. Kia ora, David.
Yeah, kia ora, Lisa. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Did you come up with any solutions?
Yeah, well, we're focusing on, I think of it in two ways, Lisa. One is the immediate problem, and it is a crisis for some builders. They cannot get jib, they cannot do the work, they don't get paid. And then there's a longer-term solution. So we're focusing really on the immediate. And the real focus is any potential regulatory barriers. So there's been a lot of comment, and I think you've had on your show, about alternative products and will they get consented through the local authorities. And so we've really focused on that. And so MB is doing some work around alternative product solutions and advice to the consent authorities about how they can treat that. So I think they're doing some really helpful work. But the other part of it is not just the consent authorities, it's also the designers and builders. So I've in fact just had a conversation with the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Institute of Architects, and we're going to work together on helping our collective members from a design and building point of view. Well, what does it mean for you? And if you're going to use an alternative product, what do you need to do? What do you need to understand? So I think there are some positive things, but we really need to work quickly on this.
Is it the small operators that are feeling the pinch the most in this situation?
Yeah, well, they will, because they won't have the same marketing or leverage. And, again, you've heard what Fletchers are doing in terms of allocation through the merchants, but then the merchants will make their own decision. And, rightly or wrongly, I think it's natural that they will look at their larger customers. So the smaller builders, and sometimes smaller builders have shopped around, so they won't necessarily have the same loyalty to a particular supplier. So, yes, they are certainly more vulnerable.
Do you expect more of them to go to the wall while you're waiting for this to be fixed?
I think there's a range of things where builders are already under pressure. This only adds to it. And if it carries on for any length of time, absolutely it will drive more builders to the wall.
I'm wondering why it's only now that the Ministry of Business and Innovation and Employment is sitting down to have this conversation with you guys, right? Because this problem didn't just eventuate overnight. Does it take big names like Simplicity and Naylor Love speaking up to get any action?
We've been talking for a few weeks. I think...
But this has been going on for months, hasn't it, David?
Yeah, well, it certainly has, and it's accelerated. I think that's what's really happened, where it's become so apparent that the regulators realise it has to be part of the solution. But that's true for all of us. I think ideally we should have started this several months ago.
And so why didn't it happen several months ago? Is that again because of the grip that Fletcher Building has on the market?
I think it might be a bit of complacency.
From who?
One's really, from all of us, to be honest, including from the regulator, including from potentially consent authorities, but also from the industry, that we thought, it'll be sorted out. So I think there has been complacency across the board, and we can't let this, we've got to fix it now, and we can't let it happen again.
So, David, if you're a small operator, right, and you're building a house and you go in today and you say, I need a house lot of jib,
yep.
How long do you reckon it takes to get it? What are you hearing?
I don't know, but, up to 6 months.
6 months?
Could be as long as 6 months, yep. I know, for instance, talking to one of our builders who does renovations more, he's turned down a couple of jobs because he said, I don't know when I can get the product. It's not just jib, but in particular jib. So it's best that we don't start this because I'll need you to get out of the home and I can't do that to you. So it's best that you just delay your project.
So Fletcher says it's a free market and it supports a free market, and there are 5 other approved plasterboards and anyone can enter the market, right? But what is the actual reality here?
Well, the reality is that they are, a very, very dominant player. I think, and that's the longer-term solution, Lisa, we didn't so much focus on today, but again, I think there's 2 parts to that. One is, are there any regulatory barriers to others coming in? And I think that can be dealt with. But the second is whether any other player wants to come in and what sort of commitment, because we are a small market. And some of the other players,
doesn't history tell you, David, that players do want to come? Because you've had some that have come, but they can't get a foothold and compete, and they leave. And they weren't just here for 5 minutes, they were here for a few years. So what does that tell us?
Yeah, well, that's right. So what it says is that they're not getting a foothold, as you say. In some cases, I think, I think that's where the Commerce Commission report will be really important, that they really dig in closely and say what is going on. But in some cases, I would also say from the builder's point of view, what they have found is that jib are very good in supporting them. And if other players want to get a foothold, they're going to have to compete in that part of the market. And I'm not sure that they've done that yet. Now, they might say it's just not worth it. It's too hard. So I think that's what we need to understand much more clearly.
One of the things that has been pointed out as a part of the problem is builders stockpiling. Is it happening and to what extent?
I don't know the extent. I imagine it will be happening to a degree, but I don't think that's the cause of the problem. That's a reaction to the problem.
So do you think that's a bit of a diversion?
Well, if people are saying that's the problem, then that is a diversion in my view. I don't think stopping stockpiling will fix the problem.
Fletcher's reckons that's part of the problem. Are they wrong?
I listened to to the chief executives. I think what I heard him saying is he didn't think that was a major part. And I certainly agree with that. It's not the major driver of the problem.
Appreciate your time, David. Thank you for joining us. That is David Kelly from Master Builders. He's the CEO. It is 28 minutes to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. And it's time to get to the business news. Ko taku hua NINA called Giles Beckford, our business editor, joins us live from Wellington. OK, Giles, not good news at the supermarket. Inflation is going to push through 7%.
Kia ora to you, Lisa. Yes, that's the upshot of numbers that we saw today, which was food prices rising, picking up pace, food inflation to 6.8% in the 12 months ended May. And rents also, some rent data that was out today, they're rising 4% in the 12 months period. put that together and their contributions to the overall consumer price index, and it indicates that inflation, which was 6.9% at the end of March, will tick up probably to 7.2, perhaps 7.3%, possibly even higher. You've got to throw in the effects there of more expensive fuel caused by the Ukraine war. And one thing that is always there underneath the radar a wee bit, but the New Zealand dollar, which has fallen 8% so far this year against the US dollar, and a lot of commodities, of course, are priced in US dollars. That fall in the New Zealand dollar has made those imports more expensive. So the expectation is now that inflation will go through the 7% barrier. Well, that'll be the longest or the highest since 1990. And the issue isn't so much that it hits 7% or more, but it's how long it stays around these levels. The longer it stays, the more the pain, and the more the Reserve Bank will be determined to increase interest rates to get inflation back into its 1 to 3% target zone. So all I can say is it looks like pain in the pocket will continue for quite some time yet. ASB, for instance, have done a calculation today. They don't think that the annual inflation rate will dip much towards 6% before the end of the year. Only a month or so ago, some people were confidently saying, it'll be back towards 4% by the end of the year. It would seem no such luck.
Giles, let's move on to what you call the market mayhem. What's happening?
Market mayhem, it's just a bit more blood on the share market floors around the world. We saw hefty losses on Wall Street, up to nearly 5% for some of the indices there. You can't hide at times like this, and so it flows right through markets. Even though we're not directly related to Wall Street, New Zealand has caught the same cold. So our market has fallen, what are we today? 2.6% lower, down 280 points. That's seen some pretty hefty falls for some of the heavyweight stocks. Fletcher Building, for instance, down 5% or so. Main Freight down. Only a handful of stocks out of 150 or 60 on the market managed to get even the merest rise in their prices. Australia, which is a big influence on the way we perform, it was down more than 4% when I last looked. So it looks like we're in for some rugged and volatile trading yet. It all depends on what the Federal Reserve does and says, which we'll see Thursday morning. Expectations are for another hefty rate rise, and once again they set the tone for world financial markets, so we'll have to bear the pain. On the currency front, New Zealand dollar once again on the back foot, talking about it, falling 8% so far this year. We're at 62.8 US cents. Now that's basically a reflection of the US dollar being so strong. We just fall as a result, but we're still a little bit groggy against the Aussie at 90.3 Australian.
So, Giles, in a word, to avoid cardiac arrest, avoid looking at your KiwiSaver for the next couple of days or so.
I've been saying that for quite some time. It arrives. The figure I think that's more important for people to look at, rather than it's down 3% this quarter or this month or whatever, is to say, what is the target looking like if I keep saving? Where will I be by the time I'm age 65? And that of course, is on your KiwiSaver statement these days, as is the dollar sum of what you're being charged by your KiwiSaver provider. Those are the numbers to look at, and then you can start asking questions of your KiwiSaver provider if you need it.
Thanks, Giles. That's Giles Beckford joining us live from Wellington. ACC doesn't have a strong privacy culture. Its policies are outdated and its staff have a narrow view of what privacy breaches are. Those are just some of the findings in a damning independent report into how client information is managed at the agency. The review, carried out by lawyer Linda Clark, was commissioned after RNZ revealed last year that some call centre staff shared and laughed at clients' injuries on Snapchat. And one client's old sensitive claim was viewed hundreds of times by more than 90 staff. Here's Anusha Bradley.
The review finds ACC's privacy policies are based on outdated legislation. There are no measures to prevent employee browsing of client files, and staff do not understand that sharing client details with other staff who don't need to know that information is wrong. Of the 30 recommendations made in the review, ACC has completed 6, but all the work won't be completed until the end of next year. ACC's Chief Executive Megan Main says improving privacy measures and culture is top of her to-do list.
The review did call out that we do have a culture of privacy, but it has been too narrow. So we really want to take that more holistic view of how we think about people's personal information all throughout the organisation in everything we do. And I'm very committed to developing that culture within ACC.
The review finds the 12 call centre workers who shared client details on Snapchat were mostly young, new to ACC, and some had no privacy training. The Snapchats were shared during a national lockdown as a way to keep in touch with colleagues and share stressful work calls with clients. Some of the issues detailed in the report were identified by ACC's own privacy team in 2019 when it carried out an assessment of privacy risks associated with its new case management system. The review finds ACC did not take these risks seriously, but Megan Main denies it was a missed opportunity.
We receive almost 10,000 new claims every day, and we've got people across the organisation working on these. We do need to strike the balance, but I want to make sure that we strike that balance while protecting people's personal information, whilst also enabling our people to do their jobs.
The review was prompted in part by RNZ's reporting about a man we'll call Matthew, who discovered 92 staff had accessed his old sensitive claim 350 times. He says he's not surprised by the review's findings, but he's disappointed clients like him were not allowed to take part in the review. These are Matthew's words, but not his voice.
I do not think this audit will bring about the changes necessary to return faith that ACC will respect claimants' privacy, as I feel it does not address all issues and the problems within the ACC complaints process and failings to investigate client concerns thoroughly from a neutral perspective. This audit shows the concern, but I don't feel the recommendations address it.
ACC has since reduced the number of staff with access to sensitive claims by nearly 40%. It's also putting in measures to restrict access to files and monitor who is looking at them.
And it's 20 to 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And kia ora anō, after 6, we're going to talk to the Sports Minister about a new Crown-funded integrity unit. Homai o whakaaro, love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme. Text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Particularly interested if you're waiting to see a GP in your district, how long does it take to get an appointment? Time to get to the headlines. Ko iwi anō tēnei.
Armed police remain on guard in the small North Waikato town of Taupiri, where shots were fired outside a primary school this morning. The police say the shooting isn't related to wider gang tensions, but they're looking into an incident yesterday that they believe is connected. As many as half the country's GP clinics aren't enrolling new patients amid a concoction of winter illnesses, COVID infections and short staffing. Dr Brian Betty from the New Zealand College of General Practitioners told Checkpoint it's becoming very serious in several areas, Northland particularly, Invercargill, parts of Hawke's Bay, South Taranaki, East Porirua and South Auckland. Dairy owners are demanding the incoming police minister take a tougher approach than his predecessor and want to meet with him as soon as possible. Chris Hipkins has been given the portfolio after the Prime Minister stripped it from Poto Williams, saying she'd lost focus. Building industry leaders met with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment to talk about solutions to the jib plasterboard shortage. Master Builder Chief Executive David Kelly told Checkpoint industry leaders are focusing on immediate answers. And a damning independent review finds ACC's privacy culture is poor, its policies outdated and staff aren't well informed. The review, carried out by lawyer Linda Clark, was commissioned after RNZ revealed a group of call centre workers shared client information on Snapchat. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, there are a number of closures across Auckland's motorway network tonight, including a full closure of westbound lanes on State Highway 16 between Stanley Street and Hobson Street. And the South Island State Highway 6 from Inangahua to Upper Bulla Gorge is now closed because of a slip, and State Highway 94 from Holliford to Chasm remains closed because of the snow. I'll update you with news and weather at 6.
Ngā mihi Evie, enough plans and too much talk. It's time to curb cars on Queen Street. That's the message from Auckland Central MP Chloe Swarbrick and the City Centre Residents Group, who have launched a petition calling on Auckland Council to take action now to pedestrianise the iconic CBD street. It's 10 years since Council signed off the City Centre Master Plan, but Swarbrick says there's been little action. But some roadblocks remain. Here's our reporter Nick Trubridge and cameraman Nick Monroe.
It's the downtown debate that refuses to die, kicking cars off Queen Street in favour of a pedestrian paradise.
Long overdue, should have done it years ago.
I've had to park at the top to just walk down to a shop down the bottom.
Get rid of the cars, get rid of the air emission, and it'll be okay. There'll be no stress.
For 10 years, proponents say they've been waiting to vanquish the vehicle, waiting to welcome the walk.
Those organisations which are charged with the implementation of the CCMP have all the feedback they need. We're now really at the point where we want to see that implemented. Less sort of hooey and more doey, as it were.
Meet Anthony Phillips from Auckland's City Centre Residents Group. The CCMP he refers to is the City Centre Master Plan Auckland Council passed back in 2012. A Queen Street local of 15 years, Mr Phillips is fed up with talk, but not enough action.
We're not anti-car, we're just pro-people. And by pedestrianising Queen Street doesn't mean that service vehicles, couriers, all those other things that we need are going to be prevented from coming here. It just might mean there's a more coordinated effort to how some of those essential vehicles, including emergency vehicles, have access.
The petition, launched by Green MP Chloe Swarbrick in conjunction with the Residents Group, reignites a fire under a debate that can be traced back a decade and beyond. Mr Phillips arguing ditching drivers will bring another timely benefit.
We've had a series of ram raids in the city centre on Queen Street. We had the luxury stores down to the bottom of Queen Street, Smith and Coe's, in the last 24 hours. If we had Queen Street pedestrianised, we wouldn't have those issues.
But what about those trying to earn a living on the street all sides are desperate to see return to its former glory? Nitin Aswal, manning the counter of explosive supplements, is in two minds as to whether gains can be made by continuing to muscle out cars.
It's a mix of both, but yeah, it has affected businesses, but at the same time, since not that many people are working 5 days a week in the CBD, I think it's not gonna be that much of a difference because a lot of people are still buying stuff online.
But across the street in fast phone repair, manager David Das is a little more clear-cut.
Most of our customers were from outside. They used to park on the road. We had plenty of car parks used to be, but now we cannot find any car park for the customers, and we are less likely to get fewer customers than before.
But here's something of a surprise. Chloe Swarbrick and the CCRG have arguably an unlikely ally in this guy, the soon-to-step down Auckland Business Chamber boss, Michael Barnett.
I think it's an idea that has merit. There's going to be a couple of things that will make a difference. Firstly, we need to remember this is about business and people. They need to be able to work together and plan together.
But pumping the brakes is heart of the city. Its chief executive, Viv Beck, partly behind last year's failed High Court bid, seeking an injunction stopping further temporary work to make Queen Street more pedestrian-friendly. Head of Advocacy, Tanya Loveridge, today telling Checkpoint the city simply can't handle more road cones, diversions, barricaded businesses right now.
I think the time for really making wholesale changes to Queen Street beyond what's planned is probably once the CRL is finished, because we've got to think about circulation plans. We've got buses down Queen Street. We're not going to be able to look at how we actually remove all the vehicles off Queen Street until we can find other places for them to go.
So along the CBD's main drag, debate rages. Cars and people continue to coexist. But for how long? Battle lines are drawn.
Queen Street is an opportunity for pedestrians. We need to embrace moving forward. We need to not look back. There is a world ahead which is a greener, cleaner world, and we need to be part of that. We need to hurry up about making it happen.
Yeah, I think it would make it less accessible to people, and people trying to get from the bottom of town to the top of town. It would make it quite difficult, and more traffic jam.
More business comes to the city when people can walk through it safely and comfortably instead of having to dodge cars and taxis and buses.
Buskers, eye-to-eye contact, none of us, I don't know you, and street vendors can be possible. Like I used to cook mussels. My name is Kāpai Mussels, Dr. Ropata, Te Moera Morrison. I'm from Kotamangere.
Meanwhile, the man at the top, Mayor Phil Goff, says he remains in support of full pedestrianisation of Queen Street. First, its footpaths are being broadened by up to 9 metres in some places. There's 2 lanes only for buses, service and emergency vehicles. Eventually, exclusions for private vehicles will reduce traffic even further. But don't expect things to move quickly. Mr Goff saying doing it all at once will require significant works when some are already struggling in the face of City Rail Link in a city battling back from successive lockdowns.
It is 12 minutes to 6. If you're listening to that one on radio, the video version filmed by Nick Munro will go up on our webpage. And I bet you've got some opinions on whether we should pedestrianise Queen Street. Text us 2101. Kia mau tonu mai, you're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National, and a bunch of you have already got in touch about the GP shortage. This listener says, I live in Whangarei and can wait up to 3 weeks for an appointment. Wow. 2 months is the wait, apparently, to see a GP in Northland at Cooper's Beach. Someone else says, yes, there's the problem now, but 60% of GPs are down to retire in the next 10 years. We need to double the amount of medical students and bond a percentage to the GP and rural GP roles by assisting with their fees. That one's from Duncan. On the subject of flu jabs, because there are lots of them available at the moment, only half of them have been taken, and the Director General of Health is telling people to get a rattle on, basically. Emma says, my husband and I both got free flu jabs today in the Hastings New World. The nurses in the mobile vaccination truck were absolutely lovely, and we got given a $20 voucher for New World too. Whoa, lucky you. A great initiative. I'm 37 years old with 2 children. It was something I had been meaning to do, but hadn't gotten around to it until this opportunity presented today. Thanks for getting in touch, Emma. And let's head to the US now. A second day of public hearings at the US Congress has heard how Donald Trump was detached from reality once it became clear he'd lost the election. The committee investigating last year's Capitol attack showed video of former Trump advisors, such as his Attorney General, William Barr, testifying that Mr. Trump showed no interest in facts, but rather nonsense and crazy stuff. CNN's Jessica Schneider has more.
The January 6th committee back to spotlight how former President Trump was intent on spreading lies about the 2020 election being stolen, choosing to listen to his allegedly drunk advisor Rudy Giuliani on election night instead of the aides telling Trump he was likely to lose.
My recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell. The president disagreed with that.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani. And the mayor was definitely intoxicated.
Giuliani's lawyer denies Giuliani was drunk. It was Giuliani's advice that the former president ultimately followed that night.
Frankly, we did win this election.
The committee playing tape depositions from former Trump advisors, including his former campaign manager Bill Stepien, who was a no-show at the hearing after his wife went into labor. Multiple former officials, including a Trump White House lawyer and the president's own Attorney General Bill Barr, explained that the conspiracy theories Trump was voicing were flat out false, including the one about Dominion voting machines switching votes.
I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time.
President Trump refused to listen, despite Barr repeatedly shooting down the lies.
The claims of fraud were bullshit, completely bogus and silly, based on complete misinformation. I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact with he's become detached from reality.
Witness testimony portrayed President Trump as grasping at conspiracy theories after he lost the election.
He said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters, and that was absolute rubbish. There was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout.
There were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation.
Stepien said he considered himself part of, quote, Team Normal on the Trump campaign, as opposed to Rudy Giuliani's team, which included former Trump advisor Peter Navarro, who were pushing multiple false claims.
I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure, and I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president.
Pushing the big lie turned out to be highly lucrative. The committee alleging Trump raised $250 million from donors based on those lies.
In Britain, the courts have rejected an appeal opening the way for asylum seekers who entered the UK illegally to be removed to Rwanda. 7 people are expected to be on board the flight, which is set to take off tonight. The head of the UN Refugee Agency says the policy sets a catastrophic precedent. The BBC's Mark Easton has the story.
Dozens more asylum seekers arrived on the Kent coast, 37 men who the government says should potentially face removal to Rwanda because they've travelled from France, a safe country. And this is the Boeing 767 chartered by the Home Office to take the first group of asylum seekers on a one-way ticket to Rwanda. The plane can take around 200 passengers, but a maximum of just 8 asylum seekers will be aboard, and 3 of those are in court arguing to be removed from the passenger list. The Rwanda policy divides opinion, apparent outside the courts of justice. For some, it's an effective way to deal with migrants who come to the UK illegally. For others, it's an immoral and unlawful way to treat vulnerable people who are asking the UK for sanctuary.
To stay removal of asylum seekers to...
Lawyers were making a last-ditch attempt in the Court of Appeal to stop tomorrow's Rwanda flight, but the 3 judges, led by Lord Justice Singh, decided there was not enough to overturn last week's decision to let the plane take off.
This court cannot therefore interfere with that conclusion.
Campaigners were disappointed by the judgment, but there will be a full legal review of the Rwanda policy in the courts to be completed by the end of July. At the United Nations in Geneva, the news that asylum seekers were to be forcibly removed to Rwanda was described as catastrophic.
We believe that this is all wrong. This is all wrong, this deal, for so many different reasons.
The Home Secretary has always argued that her Rwandan removals policy is designed to deter people from taking dangerous and unnecessary journeys from safe countries and will undermine the criminal operations of people smugglers. It is in the public interest, she says. But ministers believe that even if only a single asylum seeker is aboard, the flight could be a game changer in dealing with what they call illegal immigration.
The All Whites have one shot to be the 32nd and final team to qualify for this year's Football World Cup. If they qualify, they'll join Australia, who sneaked in this morning after a penalty shootout against Peru. A win in tomorrow morning's intercontinental playoff game against Costa Rica in Qatar will send the All Whites to football's showpiece event for just the 3rd time. The qualification process was impacted by the pandemic, meaning for the first time in 40 years, the All Whites have only a 1 game rather than 2 to seal their fate and a $16.5 million payday. Felicity Reid reports.
It is all over! For 27 years, New Zealand football's lived in the shadow of a great 82 side. Ricky Herbert's men have emerged from the shadows and into the lights. New Zealand are going to South Africa.
That 2009 night in Wellington won't be forgotten by New Zealand football supporters. In front of a sold-out stadium of fervent fans clad in white, a 1-0 win over Bahrain propelled the All Whites to their last Football World Cup appearance in 2010. Since then, the All Whites have failed to win intercontinental playoffs against Mexico in 2013 and Peru in 2017, keeping the Kiwis out of the pinnacle tournament for more than a decade. Tomorrow's game is against a Costa Rican team that sits 70 places higher than New Zealand in the world rankings, but coach Danny Hay is optimistic.
We've got a really good chance, a really good shot at doing something special, but we know we're up against a very good side as well, and they're certainly not going to roll over for us. It's 11 players against 11 players, and it's going to come down to small moments in the game that will decide it.
The winner of the one-off playoff will join former World Cup winners Spain and Germany, as well as Japan in Group E at the World Cup in November and December. All Whites captain Winston Reid, striker Chris Wood and defender Tommy Smith were the young guns of New Zealand's last World Cup squad. That trio are joined by a new crop of players that Hay is backing to get the win in Doha, where the temperatures will reach over 40 degrees.
We've got an exciting group of young players starting to emerge, and I think, a lot of people are probably already looking ahead to 2026 when some of them will be at their prime, but the reality is none of us have got a crystal ball. We don't know what the future holds. Our time is now.
Reid missed the All Whites' last warm-up game with a niggling injury, but he says he's fit and the team are ready for the 5-time World Cup participants, despite the Central American side playing 6 times as many competitive matches as the New Zealand side over the last 5 years.
Over the last couple of years, even though it's been difficult for us because of COVID, I think the group has gotten better, and we're here at the moment, and it's just about trying to figure a way to get past our last obstacle, which is Costa Rica, and hopefully we'll be able to do it.
Getting to a second World Cup is on Reid's mind as the former English Premier League player winds down his career, but he also knows how much it means to the entire squad and those who have gone before or who have been left behind.
Do I feel pressure? Yeah, of course you always feel pressure, but you want to do well for your country, and not only myself but the rest of the players and the staff around the team. We've been focused for such a long time now to be able to get here to this moment.
The game kicks off at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning.
I knew you'd have strong thoughts on whether to make a Queen Street pedestrian only. This person says definitely, it's long overdue. It needs a bucket fountain. We can do better than a bucket fountain. Stephen says making Queen Street pedestrian only is a terrible idea. It's too restricted now. We need proper bus pull-in areas. Pedestrians will no longer flock there with the crime and hard parking and online shopping and malls. Someone else says throw a tram in Queen Street. How good would that be? A tram from the waterfront up the city, hop on, hop off. And Lizzie, smug Lizzie, that's how she describes herself, from Canterbury, says, have you seen our riverside wonderland? When I went to Auckland, I couldn't work out where the main street was, nowhere to sit and enjoy. How was that the main street? What about Quay Street? Should we make that pedestrian only instead of Queen Street?
RNZ News at 6. Good evening. Kia ora tātou. Ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Armed police remain on guard in the small North Waikato town of Taupiri, where shots were fired outside a primary school this morning. The school was briefly put into lockdown after the shots injured a man who'd just dropped his child off. Hayes Almeida has been at the scene.
The police say several shots were fired at a man in his car at about 9:30. Despite his injuries, he was able to drive himself to the police station for help. They say the victim and the offender knew each other and the shooting is not related to wider gang tensions. Officers are looking into an incident yesterday that they believe is connected and are seeking the attacker. They say no children were directly in danger and the lockdown was a precaution.
The Education Minister has ruled out a return to mandatory masks in schools. Some are struggling to maintain regular classes because so many of their staff are ill with COVID-19 or winter illnesses. Speaking at Silverstream School in Upper Hutt today, Chris Hipkins acknowledged it's a difficult time.
Some schools have been rostering classes home for a day here and there where they have to in order to make sure they've got enough staff in front of children. Look, I know that's not ideal, but the reality is COVID-19's disrupting the country significantly and it's going to continue to do that for a wee while. And so schools, they have my full support in making the decisions they need to make in order to keep their schools functioning.
Chris Hipkins has also ruled out installing ventilation systems in all classrooms, saying it would require huge investment. The Buller District has stood down its emergency response as the wild weather over the region eases. An emergency operations centre was set up yesterday to help manage coastal inundation after huge swells washed rocks, debris and sea foam onto properties. Mayor Jamie Klein says tides and high winds over the past 24 hours have caused no further issues. He says all affected residents along the northern Buller coast have been visited by civil defence staff and offered access to a flood recovery team, and the clean-up will now be left to individual households. Contractors will continue to clear State Highway 67 as needed. Ngāi Tahu is confident its decision to leave the South Island network of whānau order providers won't be to the detriment of other services. The iwi joined the Te Pūtahitanga o Te Waipounamu network 8 years ago. Its chief executive, Adihia Bennett, says it has the capability to carry out services itself and is exercising rangatiratanga in order to help its own whānau.
This seems now like a good time to actually look at building on our health and wellbeing outcomes and actually undertaking it from a Ngāi Tahu perspective. So it seems sensible that we don't duplicate.
Adihia Bennett says the agreement with Te Pūtahitanga is mutual and they'll continue to work closely together. A man who ploughed a rented van into dozens of people on a busy Toronto street in 2018, killing 11 people, has been sentenced to life in prison. 29-year-old Alec Manasian was found guilty last year of murdering 10 people and attempting to murder 16. Justice Malloy told a crowded Toronto court she considered one of the wounded the 11th murder victim because she later died of her injuries. Manasian will not be eligible for parole until 2047. He told investigators he'd set out to kill as many people as possible and that he drew inspiration from the misogynistic incel movement of young men angry at their lack of sexual activity. The Colombian government says a former rebel leader who became one of the country's most wanted criminals has been killed by the military. The BBC's Leonardo Rocha reports.
Leader Nosque, who was known as Mayimbu, had been a member of the FARC Marxist rebel group, but he disagreed with the terms of the peace deal it signed with the Colombian government nearly 6 years ago and decided to remain in the Cauca region, where he led a group of about 100 men in criminal activity. Several armed groups, including dissident FARC members, operate in the region. They're involved in drug trafficking, kidnapping and extortion. The Defense Minister, Diego Molano, said Nosque's accomplices had prevented the authorities from retrieving his body, but soldiers had photographed his body to prove that he had been killed.
The former Australian rugby test player David Pocock has won a seat in the upper house of Parliament representing the territory surrounding the capital, Canberra. His election as the ACT's first independent senator was confirmed today, more than 3 weeks after the federal election. The 34-year-old, who has a long history of environmental activism, moved to Australia from Zimbabwe as a teenager and played 78 tests for the Wallabies between 2008 and 2019. And the Nelson City Council's chief executive is stepping down. Pat Doherty says he won't apply for another 5-year term and will leave in December to explore other opportunities. He says it's been an honour to give back to the Nelson community. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Tony Stamp samples the latest from Band of Horses. Our international relations specialist Nina Hall assesses the Prime Minister's recent trips abroad. And in this week's Sci-Fi Sci-Fact, physicist Jan Eldridge ponders the role of exoplanets in fiction. Plenty of them about in real life, but why do they all appear to have the same gravity and atmosphere as Earth? How plausible is that? On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
You're back on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Wednesday. In the west of Te Ika Maui from Northland to Kapiti, also for the central high country. Occasional showers, some heavy from this evening, clearing from Manawatu to Kapiti early tomorrow. For Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Waded Upper, Wellington, also for Nelson and Marlborough. Generally fine, but isolated showers about Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, and the odd shower elsewhere this afternoon or evening. Northwest gales and exposed places south of Hastings, easing tomorrow. For Bulla and Westland, showers, some will be heavy. Canterbury, fine, apart from a possible shower about Banks Peninsula. Central and North Otago, partly cloudy with isolated showers, clearing tomorrow. Dunedin, Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, showers, some heavy, becoming confined to Fiordland and the south coast tomorrow evening. Snow above 300 metres, westerly gales in exposed places. And for the Chatham Islands, Rekohu, showers, some heavy with possible thunderstorms, gale westerlies. It's 7 minutes past 6. I'll have the latest news headlines for you at 6:30.
Kia ora rā e ho, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Sport is getting an independent government-funded integrity body after a slew of recent reports showing athlete welfare was overlooked or not taken seriously enough. Drug-Free Sport New Zealand and some of Sport New Zealand's role, including its complaints and mediation service, will be absorbed into the new organisation. It follows damning reports into high-performance cycling and also the culture and treatment of the Black Ferns. And Sports Minister Grant Robertson is promising the new organisation will have some chops.
There are a lot of different bodies looking at integrity issues. We've had Drug-Free Sport New Zealand. We've got a complaints body now that's associated with Sport New Zealand. And we thought it was time to make sure that we brought all of that together, but also make it independent of the existing governing bodies that we have, so that people can have confidence that we've not only got clean sport, but we've got safe sport. And obviously we've seen a number of issues in recent times where we've had to work through issues of athlete well-being and integrity, and we think it's time that it had its own dedicated body independent of the rest of the sporting system.
So it's going to be a Crown entity and funded by government, is it?
Correct, that's right. But other than the funding, the intention is that it will stand independent from the government.
So how much of it is about cheating and match fixing and that kind of stuff versus athlete welfare?
Well, it's all of it together. I mean, integrity in sport requires not only that, people are competing on an even playing field when it comes to not taking drugs, but equally that, people have an experience that's positive for them, where they're treated well. And so these issues are all involved in it. The models that we've looked at around the world work best, we think, when we bring those together. We bring the power of the different elements of our system together in one place, so that people know that's where they go when they've got concerns about integrity in sport. It's also where we go to make sure that we keep high standards as well. So it'll certainly involve both of those elements.
Sport New Zealand currently has some of those functions. Have you lost confidence in Sport New Zealand?
No, and in fact, I've been working with Sport New Zealand throughout this process, but I think, the leadership in Sport New Zealand recognise as much as anybody else that to give people confidence that there's genuine independence here, that this is a place where people can go with their complaints, with their issues, where athletes know that standards are being upheld, that having that as independent as possible is actually a real advantage. And so many of the functions that Sport New Zealand do in the integrity space would transfer over to this body. They'll have a role in supporting the transitional process, but ultimately the organisation will be independent of them.
When you talk about monitoring standards, what are you talking about? A single code that everyone voluntarily signs up to, or will it be mandated in law?
Well, that's one of the things that can be worked on by the establishment committee. I mean, different sports already have a number of different processes here. This body will have a close working relationship with different national sporting organisations. But we're very clear that we want high standards here. We have that with drug-free sport, for example. So there is a code that applies across the board to all sports. When it comes to athlete wellbeing, these issues are emerging, but we've got very high expectations that we're going to improve the experience for our athletes, that will make sure that they know that they will be, their complaints will be dealt with consistently, and whether that turns into, particular codes over time, we'll wait and see. But I think having one body overseeing it will certainly help athletes have more confidence that they will be treated well and fairly.
But that's the direction you're going in, isn't it? Because in your media release, you say the new body will also be responsible for implementing a national code of sport integrity. So is that going to be across all codes? And again, is it going to be voluntary, or is this something you're going to entrench in law?
Yeah, that's the point that I'm making, is that the legislation that we establish it obviously hasn't been written yet. We've got a strong expectation that all sporting organisations will work with us on that code. Whether or not it gets legislated per se is still to be decided, but regardless of whether it's in law or not, we have an expectation that all sporting organisations will uphold high standards of athlete wellbeing, make sure that their sports are clean, and make sure that any complaint processes are consistent and clear and transparent.
Isn't that the problem, though? If you don't entrench it in law, people's expectations are different, and that's the problem that we've had so far recently. When you look into the high-performance cycling review, you look into the Black Ferns review, clearly people's expectations were different, and that's part of the reason there were problems around welfare and the way people were treated.
Yeah, look, I think having a clear and consistent code that applies to all sports is the bottom line here. Whether or not that has to be legislated to achieve what we want is the subject of further discussion. But I agree with you. I think, what we've seen over, unfortunately, a number of years and a number of different reviews is that athletes, and not just those at the high performance level, have not always had a positive experience. And then when they have raised issues, they haven't felt that they've been dealt with fairly or consistently. That will be what we'll be driving towards with a single body that can bring everybody together in that way.
So what power will this entity have? Will it be able to compel witnesses?
Well, obviously, through the complaints mechanism process we have now, there is the ability to run inquiries. What we want to do is make that as strong as possible. Again, these are the details to be worked through the transition period now. The compelling of witnesses is obviously related usually to quasi-judicial bodies. Drug-Free Sport New Zealand has some ability through the work that it does when it's doing investigations to do that. We would obviously look to see whether those functions would transfer to a wider set of complaints. That's the work that the transitional body needs to do.
And what about ability to, punish or apply penalties?
Again, through the best model we have for that is to the drug-free sport model, and there absolutely is the ability there to have penalties, but then they can be quite severe penalties. And so that's a model that's worked in terms of clean sport and making sure that people are not taking performance-enhancing drugs. The question is how well that can be transferred to other matters, and obviously that's the work that will now be undertaken by the transitional body.
Minister, given that you feel very strongly about it and you've identified it as a key priority for you as Sports Minister, do you want this entity to have some real heft?
I do. I want this entity to be one that gives athletes, both at the elite level but also those at the community sport level, absolute confidence that they're competing on a level playing field and that their experience will be a positive one, they'll be well looked after, and that where there are issues and concerns, they get dealt with seriously, transparently and effectively. So I do want this to have heft. We wouldn't be doing it in the way we are if we didn't think that. We wouldn't be putting forward a legislated body if we didn't think that. We've got to get it right. We've got to consult with the sporting community. That'll take a little bit of time, but I'm confident once it's up and running, it will deliver the things that sports people want.
Australia's got a body like this. I think it cost about $80 million to set up. So what's your budget?
Yeah, look, we're working that through at the moment. Obviously, until we finalise all of the details we've just been discussing, we can't.
Are you going to give it the money it needs, Minister? Because it's no good if they don't have the funds and resources, is it?
I certainly understand the fact that if we're going to set a body up like this, we've got to make sure it's sufficiently well resourced. The specific numbers on that will need to be debated over time.
Do you anticipate you'll be investing tens of millions of dollars in it, though?
Not necessarily. I mean, we've got to look at, the fact that we've got existing organisations that run, and we've got to look at, what their budgets are, and we'll make those decisions over time. But, again, we're establishing an independent entity here, a legislated statutory entity that will require resourcing, and we're serious about that. The exact numbers have to be identified yet.
When is it going to be up and ready?
So the plan is to have it up and running by 2024. We do have to pass legislation, and we are still in the design phase at the moment. Like I said before, we want to make sure we get this right, and we want to make sure that athletes and sporting organisations have confidence in it. That work will be undertaken over the next year or so, and we look to have it up and running by the beginning of 24.
And that's Sports Minister Grant Robertson. Samoa's Prime Minister Fiame Naomi Mataafa is visiting New Zealand, meeting Jacinda Ardern for the first time. In a meeting today, described as warm and productive, the leaders discussed climate change, China, and the Treaty of Friendship between our two countries. RNZ Pacific's Lydia Lewis reports.
New Zealand rolled out the red carpet today. Fiame Naomi Mataafa greeted at the headlands by tangata whenua. The meeting comes to a head as key milestones are celebrated. 60 years of Samoa's independence.
And importantly, the commemoration of the Treaty of Friendship on August 1st, when Samoa will open its borders to everyone. Prime Minister, I've formally conveyed to you an invitation for a delegation from the New Zealand government to travel to Samoa, where we can hold a commemoration on that day.
Samoa's Prime Minister has finally announced an official date for the Pacific Islands Forum. Pacific leaders are to meet between the 12th and 14th of July in Suva. Today's meeting between the two leaders is a first. It is Fiame Naomi Mataafa's first time meeting with Jacinda Ardern in her role as Prime Minister. Samoa's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peseta Naumeasimi, says the trip has been revealing, showing her Prime Minister is held in high regard across the region.
I think she's inspiring as a leader, particularly to the younger generations and especially among the female.
Fiame Naomi Mataafa didn't show up with the shopping list though.
I'm not in a rush as a new leader to be coming up with a shopping list of any sort.
And China was not at the top of the agenda despite Samoa's new agreement. But for anyone wondering,
there are no discussions between Samoa and China on militarization at all.
Fiame Naomi Mataafa is pleased with what has been announced or reaffirmed.
To mark these important milestones, I'm pleased to announce a special fellowship in the name of the Right Honourable Prime Minister Fiame Mataafa. We are also restarting the Prime Minister's Fellowship for Samoa. In addition, we are launching new Sports Leadership Awards aimed at supporting emerging leaders in sport in Samoa, particularly women and girls.
She says this visit is an opportunity to reflect and reprioritise.
Climate change, of course, is always at the top of that.
Whether or not the Prime Minister of Samoa believes New Zealand's commitment to that is enough is unknown. A climate aid fund for the Pacific has been topped up, a fourfold increase to $1.3 billion by New Zealand. But the matter of New Zealand as a Pacific island in the Blue Pacific, a commitment to look after the oceans and the nations who depend on it, may not be as clear-cut as a handshake and a wave.
Are you satisfied, though, that New Zealand is up to speed with its role and responsibilities as part of the Blue Pacific continent?
I hope we're all up to speed.
I'm happy for you to give us a performance appraisal.
Samoa's Prime Minister is off to sunny Hawke's Bay tomorrow to meet with seasonal workers after her government announced a review into the scheme and reduced flights.
It is 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Strong opinions on Queen Street and whether we should ban cars from there. This person says you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. I've worked in the city for decades and it has never been less appealing. There are very few, mainly generic shops. High Street is the real heart of the city, says Tony. Should we ban cars from High Street? It's thin, that street. Not much parking anyway. Someone else, though, reckons, yep, pedestrianised Queen Street. Another says, really? Seriously? Look at what is happening with Lambton Quay. Take cars out and the road will die. On the GP shortage, this is an interesting one from up in Northland, Kirikiri. This listener says they've been waiting for 6 months to get into a doctor's office there. One of the local doctors' lists is closed. Why can we not train more doctors, they say? Interesting opinions on this as well. Someone writes, it is clear that the GP workforce is under great stress. New Zealand needs to train more doctors and GPs in general and then discourage trained doctors from leaving for overseas. Solution, naturally, as usual, is the M word. Money, they reckon. And this one, before we move on, you only need to compare the conditions and remuneration for GPs versus the hospital specialists. No wonder it's not a first choice, medical professionals, particularly with demanding nature of their form filling to comply with co-payment requirements. They earn half the money and work twice the hours for half as much leave. Time that hard-working GPs were appreciated for what they achieve for this country's health. Russian forces continue to batter the eastern Ukraine Donbas region, engaging in battles the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says are among the most brutal in European history. As Russia dominates the skies, President Zelensky is again calling for the Western allies to send more missile defence systems. The BBC's Orla Guerin has this report.
Max speed. We're told to drive at maximum speed on the exposed road to Lysychansk. A dark horizon greets us. Residents praying for salvation as Russia lays waste Ukrainian troops called for help to take away one more victim of Russian shelling. Nearby, the rush to evacuate civilians who have to duck for cover. A panicked departure in an armoured truck.
Well, people are taking this chance to get out while they can, but they know this could be a one-way journey. If the Russians take this territory, and they're getting closer all the time, these people may never be able to come back to their city and their homes.
The situation is critical, a rescue worker says. Can't you hear the shelling? So another city empties out, here in eastern Ukraine. A few more wait anxiously for their turn, hoping to outrun moving front lines. Volodymyr is among them. He's sick and headed to hospital. He tells me that life here was calm until the war broke everything apart. And it has left its terrible mark. This was the Palace of Culture, now standing as grim testament to Moscow's superior firepower. Ukraine's president says Lysychansk is already dead, along with neighbouring Severodonetsk, ghost cities now.
It's not just destroying apartment buildings and flats and homes. It's destroying history and the fabric of cities. And this is a deliberate tactic: bomb, shell, burn, and leave nothing but scorched earth.
Those who remain make brief escapes from their basements to cook outdoors. The city has no power or running water. But Yelena still clings to her home, despite the growing threat.
Do you think the Russians will take the city soon? It seems like they're getting close.
I don't know, she says. We're hoping it'll be okay. But the city is running out of time. This is now an artillery war. Ukraine doesn't have enough big guns or ammunition. At the 11th hour, another plea for help.
My message and message of Ukrainian people, I think we need victory, we need peace, and we cannot get a peace and a victory without help our partners, because without equipment for our artillery, I think we cannot get a victory in this terrible war.
As we spoke, the war came closer. That was a Russian shell whistling over our heads. Just a short distance away, neighbouring Severodonetsk is burning and may soon fall.
Now to possibly the most ambitious project ever undertaken in the field of biology. Scientists plan to sequence the genomes of all forms of life on the British Isles. That's about 70,000 species. It could transform how we understand the natural world and may benefit humans in search of medicines and materials inspired by nature. The BBC's Rebecca Morrell has this report.
Our weird and wonderful natural world. From a delicate sea creature called a brittle star to a hermit's crab carrying a sea anemone on its back. All of these creatures were scooped up just off the coast of Plymouth.
So you've got two worms here, and this one, it's almost made these overlapping scales of kind of sandy shell.
They're being collected for an ambitious new project to sequence the genomes of all life in the British Isles. Today, scientists are focusing on marine worms, known as polychaetes.
It's a big task with hundreds and hundreds of species, and we've got over 100 now, I think 120 odd species of polychaetes collected. And it seems like a lot, but really it's just the beginning.
The plan is to sequence the DNA of every plant, animal and fungi in Britain and Ireland. That's about 70,000 species. And some are surprising. There's a type of microalgae that has 200 billion letters of DNA. That's more than 60 times bigger than the human genome. And the scientists plan to do this all by 2030. The DNA extraction is being carried out at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. The human genome was sequenced here 2 decades ago. That took years, but now a species can be completed in a few days.
When the human genome was sequenced, it changed the way we do human biology forever. It's really transformed how we see ourselves and how we work with our health and illness. And we want to make that possible for all of biology. So we want everybody working on any species or any group of species anywhere in the world able to have this ultimate foundation.
One genome that is now complete belongs to the badger. In Oxfordshire, as dusk falls, a family emerges from their set. Scientists say having their detailed genetic information is vital.
Getting the badger genome sequence is really important because you can see how badgers adapt to diseases, how they adapt to their environment, and how they interact with other species in their ecosystem.
Back onshore in Plymouth, the rock pools are full of surprises. But their genetic code could also help us to find nature-inspired medicines or materials. This immense endeavour could change our understanding of the diversity of life.
Okay, before we head off, some of your final thoughts on the GP shortage. This is an interesting one. This listener reckons the government needs to reassess the GP training model proposed by Waikato University. I'm a PhD with 20 plus years research experience based in the regions and would love to retrain as a GP, but can't afford the 5+ years of medical school. There's a lot along that similar theme about changing how the qualification is obtained. Why is it so hard to get into doing a doctor qualification, drop the entry score and train more people, this listener says. Again, 2,000 students in Dunedin wanting to study medicine, 98% average needed to get in, less than 200 spaces. There's the fix, they reckon. Thank you for all your feedback. That's all we've got time for this evening. Late News team's going to keep you updated throughout the night. If you missed anything on the program, you can check us out on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. Tomorrow from 5 a.m, First Up's going to speak to a jewellery shop owner shutting down after 2 ram raids in 2 months. A lot of good videos this evening. Check them out online. Kaua e wariwari te atatero e a mātou kōrero. We will catch you tomorrow. Have a fantastic evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Armed police remain on guard in the small North Waikato town of Taupiri, where shots were fired near a primary school this morning. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, has ruled out a return to mandatory masks in schools. The Buller District has stood down its emergency response as the wild weather over the region eases. And building industry leaders have today met with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment to talk about solutions to the jib plasterboard shortage. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
In 2008, the Dunedin-based singer Anne-Marie Nelson recorded an album over in Melbourne. Ever since then, she's kept it to herself, but she's just released it, and it's a gem.
No cares for me, I'm happy as I can be. I learned to love and to live, devil may care.
Dunedin's Anne-Marie Nelson on Inside Out with me, Nick Tipping, Wednesday night at 11 on RNZ National.
Kia ora, Nick. Looking forward to that tomorrow night on RNZ National. I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another evening, keeping you company through until midnight. Coming up after the news at 7, my first guest, the international specialist, Nina Hall. We'll be looking at the Prime Minister's recent trips abroad. One of the main messages being New Zealand is open for business. Now, how much was that for the benefit of the places she visited, such as the United States or Australia? How much was it a domestic message for the folk back home? Nina talks about all that after the news at 7. For the rest of this half hour, it's time for one of my favourite pieces on the radio at the moment. It's Tahi Rua Tolowha for Party People.
Ngā kora o rātou mā tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Ko mihi ngarangi a hau nau mai ki te ahi kāroa o ngā taki whai tikanga o te wā. Welcome to Party People, funded through the Public Interest Journalism Fund. As you can see, we have finally made it through to broadcasting quarantine and have returned to the sweet green pastures of RNZ studios here in Tāmaki Makaurau. Joining us on this most auspicious occasion is the young buck of Māori political commentating, former National MP and proud shore boy, Dan Bidwa, tēnā koe.
Kia ora.
And of course, te pūru o te Waimana, the old bull of the Party People paddock, political campaigner Shane Te Pau, tēnā kōrua.
Kia ora. Kia ora.
Well, papa te whae te tiri, hiko te uira, it's been thunder and lightning in the weather and in politics in the last 36 hours, 24 hours. The PM's press release said it would be, her cabinet reshuffle would be minor, but it was much more than that. Let's talk about Chris Whāwhoi. He leaves his positions of broadcasting, justice and immigration. He leaves in the middle of the most significant broadcasting reform possibly in our history. Dan, what do you make of his departure midway through the TVNZ-RNZ merger?
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't help with the merger going on. And if you look at stats of mergers, anywhere from 70 to 80% of mergers fail. So, to have a minister leave halfway through doesn't bode well for the governance and making sure the merger is successful. So certainly not good, but look, his heart wasn't in it. He wanted to go.
That stat, is that public mergers?
That's so that's Harvard Business Review. That's basically on all mergers that they've studied, and their finding is that most mergers fail, essentially. So to have a minister leave halfway through, it's not good. So look, it's going to be key to make sure the new minister comes in and asks the right questions and make sure they are holding this board accountable, this establishment board accountable for that. So look, hey, I know Chris, he's a really good guy. Clearly just wants to spend more time with his whānau, so good on him. But he certainly leaves at a tough time for his portfolios. Immigration, he's a bit of a mess at the moment, so there's going to be a lot to do for Michael Wood in that role coming up.
Ka pai, I was going to challenge the figures, but I realised that he's the Harvard graduate of all three of us, so I'll believe you.
Yeah.
So Willie Jackson, he's another former broadcaster.
Yeah.
He'll replace him. Is he up for the challenge?
Of course he is, but I think that the part that Daniel has missed out. He's been the Associate Minister of Broadcasting. His hands have been all over this particular, and his baby has been the public broadcasting platform and funding. He was involved in the game for many years. He'll know the key protagonist. He is a champion of public broadcasting. He's worked on this side of the camera, the other side of the camera. I think it will be seamless. The other thing is that Willie is a very good negotiator, and he will not be afraid of democracy. He will ask the questions that need to be asked. So I think the transition from Whāwhoi to Jackson will be seamless.
He's now in charge of the entire sector, Minister Jackson. Could it make it easier? Could this be one of the successful mergers?
Well, look, that's the rationale, I guess, from the Prime Minister. From what I understand of Willie, he's a really nice guy, but he's a bit of a showman as well. So he'll need to, I think, display.
He's a broadcaster.
He's a broadcaster, right? So he's certainly got all the experience, but he needs more than that. He needs to bring all of that to the fore to make sure he's asking the right questions and to make sure that he's holding the establishment board accountable so that ultimately this is successful. And what does success look like for this merger? It's not just about upholding the interests of the Fourth Estate and the independence and the objectivity. It's also about making sure the taxpayers get value for money, that there's things like online is very clear, that the public funding system is clear and better it's got to be better, and that this process goes smoothly. So look, I wish him luck, but it's not a small job in any feat.
Ka pai. Chris Whafo, he's also vacating those portfolios for Justice and Immigration, the big ones. So Justice going to Kiritapu Ellen. She's got a law background. She understands the system.